Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another Street Fighter 6 video on the channel. Once again, before we do start, a quick thank you for all of the love and support you guys have been giving for this Street Fighter coverage on the channel. It means a lot, and means that there will be plenty more coming your way. But with that said, seeing as we have covered the poster boy of the series, it feels only right that we talk about his lifelong rival and fellow practitioner of Ansatsuken, the hot-blooded United States martial arts champion, Ken Masters. Now, Ken as a character is a very interesting contrast to what we see from Ryu. Whilst Ryu himself had somewhat humble beginnings, Ken, on the other hand, comes from the West and grew up with a wealthy family and a form of arrogance because of it. But through training and time alongside Ryu, you get to see Ken evolve as a human being. He learns about compassion and humility, and we really see that blossom in his character as he goes from student to champion to father and even a teacher. Ken as a character is one that really evolves so much from his very first appearance, which is a very different contrast to what we see from Ryu, the ever-wandering warrior. So if you are interested in watching that, I will have a notification here where you can click and watch it. I do actually highly recommend checking it out, as these two characters are two different sides of the same coin, so you may get more of a full experience by doing so. Now, just before we do start, I will say this will be me strictly focusing on Ken Masters, not the violent Ken persona that has become quite popular in the last few years. Plus, I do think it deserves a video of its own, so you do have that to look forward to. But now, as always everyone, before we do begin, if you're liking the Street Fighter coverage here and wish to see more, please do give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and tick that bell to stay up to date with all of the history of episodes coming out over the next few weeks, as we're not too far away now from Street Fighter 6's release. So without any further ado, let's get on to talking about Ken Masters. Now, to talk about Ken, we must first dial the clock back all the way before the events of the first Street Fighter to understand his origin. In saying that, there is currently two different interpretations of how Ken studied under Gouken and met Ryu. The first, and more common, well-known depiction of Ken is that Ken comes from an extremely wealthy family, vast in money and wealth. Because of this, Ken was largely spoiled by his parents, as money had no worth to him, and due to this, he developed a form of arrogance that caused a lot of friction with his family. Ken's father, seeing him as undisciplined, would have him be sent to Japan in order to learn some humility and respect, believing that his old-time friend, the monk Gouken, could straighten out his son and teach him values that he had never come to learn from his home in the United States. Now, in the second depiction, and the current one that is floating around, is that instead of the States, Ken was raised in Japan, but is still from an extremely wealthy family. Ken's mother and father were at a breaking point in their marriage, where divorce did seem imminent. So Ken, in a somewhat last-ditch effort to unite his parents, would begin to act out so he could unite them together. Ken, at a very young age, would begin to dye his hair blonde and get into fights at school. So this origin is slightly tweaked, but the result is ultimately the same, where he would be sent off to train with Gouken. Now, unfortunately, Capcom has always had a rather fragile relationship with the Street Fighter canon, as it is quite literally all over the place, with 3 or 4 versions of the same game, and some games just no longer being canon. So for the time being, just consider both origins, both pseudo-canon, only truly being official when Capcom decide to canonize it. With that said, let's get back to Ken's origins. Now, at the young age of 12, the young Ken Masters would be introduced to Gouken, a monk that lived far away from society, teaching the art of Ansatsuken to his adopted ward, Ryu. At first, understandably, there was a little bit of friction from Ken as he felt robbed of his wealth and cast out into the wild. So Ken was quite upset for a while, but was very quickly drawn to Gouken's teachings of Ansatsuken, the assassin's fist. So Ken would train alongside Ryu, and in time, Ken would foster an incredible amount of respect for Gouken's teachings and lifestyle. He'd also developed quite a strong brother-like relationship with the young Ryu. Having sensed his potential, Ken knew that he had to work twice as hard to make up for his lost time. So Ken actually gained the unique ability to cast fire when he performed a Shoryuken, something that Ryu could not emulate. Once the two hit 23 years old, Gouken decided that their training was done and that it was time that they left the dojo and showed the world just how good they were, what they were capable of. Ken would travel out to the west, whilst Ryu decided to remain in the east, wishing to take on the Muay Thai champion, Sagat, as Ken himself set off to the United States, where he would compete in a multitude of different tournaments, winning them all the way from the east to the west coast, being dubbed by many as the United States champion. And it's also during this time where he wins over a woman by the name of Eliza. But upon returning to Japan to show his accolades to Gouken, he would find his master dead, killed by a shadowy figure wearing a dark gi. When Ken tried to confront him, he was immediately struck down and rendered unconscious. When Ken struggled back to his feet, the assailant was gone and Ryu had just arrived, with both having more questions than answers at their fingertips. Knowing that these answers would exist beyond the dojo, Ryu would decide to hunt down his master's killer, whilst Ken himself decided to return back to the US. But not before getting a sparring match in, with both now being champions in their own right. However, Ryu's mind is clouded. Being unable to focus, he is very quickly defeated. And Ken, having sensed this, hands him his headband as an eternal reminder of their friendship and bond. So the two do part ways, and this now leads into the Alpha series. Now, Street Fighter Alpha 1 is largely regarded as non-canon, but during the events of Alpha 3, Ken, much like Ryu, is inspired to expand his horizons, wanting to travel the world, opposed to just that of the US and talented fighters. And it's here where he crosses paths with Karin Kanzuki, the rival of Sakura, a massive fangirl of Ryu and their style of fighting. Noticing how Karin's own rivalry with Sakura emulates his with Ryu's, they do spar, with Ken giving her the advice to continue to chase after Sakura, so that together they can both grow as fighters. And speaking of Sakura, he does cross paths with her, but is horrified to learn that Ryu has been taken by a shadowy organization, Shadoloos, an international crime syndicate led by the dictator M.Bison. So Ken would set out with Sakura to save his friend, but during their assault, he would be defeated by the dictator and is brainwashed by his psycho power. Ken is only relieved of his bonds once he is defeated by Ryu, who would then go on to defeat Bison himself, leading to the first canonical defeat of the dictator. The pair then have an extremely brief reunion before once again parting ways. And this now leads us up into Street Fighter 2, where Ken actually loses his fighting spirit, not because he lost or because of the events of Alpha 3, but instead because of Eliza. He had fallen so deeply in love with her that it somewhat broke his routine. Eliza became his top priority, but one day, Ken would receive a letter from Ryu, who was thrilled and excited for their next bout. And this letter lit up Ken's fighting spirit. Not wanting to let his brother down, Ken would immediately return back to training, wanting to pick up where he had left off. And fortunately, Ken would be invited to another tournament, one hosted by the recently returned M.Bison. The dictator was not truly dead, seeking vengeance against those responsible for his downfall. Thus, he held this tournament as a way to kill his enemies. And as this went underway, Ken would enter the tournament and promise to win it for Eliza, saying that if he did, he would marry her. Now again, due to Street Fighter 2 having come out during the prime arcade era of games, it's rather hard to pin down what exactly had happened. But from what we do know is that Ken would be eliminated by Ryu and Bison would be destroyed by Akuma. Although Ken does ultimately fail in his promise to Eliza, the pair do go on to get married regardless, and life is relatively peaceful for Ken, as Eliza does become pregnant. So this now does take us up to the events of Street Fighter 4, making an appearance in its tie-in prequel movie, The Ties That Bind. This movie in itself is designed to fill in for the downfall of Shadoloos and the rise of Sin, the weapons division of the crime syndicate that would take over once its predecessor fell, now led by the android Seth, seeking to harvest the world's strongest fighters in order to become the ultimate specimen. So naturally, Ryu would fall into their crosshairs. As this was going underway, Ken would be attending to Eliza's needs, as well as now owning his family's enterprise. Although Ken enjoyed running the family business, in a way, he couldn't help but envy the lifestyle that Ryu had. Something simple, something easy. Now one day, after working strenuous hours, he would be found by Sakura, who warned him of Sin's plans, and how she herself was tracking down Ryu, fearing that he would be next on their hit list. Now Ken himself, being very familiar with Shadoloos' actions, would set off with her to track him down. But as they do so, when they locate him, they do find him having given in to the darkest side of Ansatsuken, the Satsue no Hado. Consumed by his rage, Ryu does go on a rampage until he is stopped by Sakura. Once they rendezvous at the Master's estate, they would be joined by Guile and Chun-Li, and it's here where Ken learns that Eliza was kidnapped whilst he saved Ryu. Enraged, Ken and his allies would track down Sin's ship, where Eliza would be rescued and Seth would be defeated. Yet, it didn't actually mean the end of Sin itself, as Seth was saved by Bison's heavenly kings, meaning that the dictator was far from dead. So this now takes us on to the official events of Street Fighter 4, where Seth has created a tournament of his own. Ken would enter in the hopes of defeating Sin, and once again, of course, crossing paths with Ryu. Now during the events of 4, we know that Ken does get his wish and fights Ryu, although the outcome is unknown. He crosses paths with the likes of Rufus, and it is implied that he redeemed himself against Bison. But it's what happens after the tournament that has a huge impact on Ken, as Gouken returns back from the dead, having emptied his soul when his brother, Akuma, performed the Raging Demon. Following this point, we learn that Gouken went into hiding, so once Ryu and Ken confront him, Ken is understandably extremely upset that he did not reveal his existence for so long after perishing, but Ryu can't help but laugh at how cunning their teacher is. But the true beauty of this story is when Ken returns back home, as he is reunited with Eliza, and the two have their first child, Mel. With the end of 4, this now canonically takes us to the events of Street Fighter 5, and its main narrative, A Shadow's Fall. During this particular installment, we learn that with the fall of Sin, Shadoloo has now returned in full force, utilizing what is known as the Black Moon. Weapons of mass destruction scattered across the globe and ready to blow on Bison's whim. But it's far from simple for the dictator. As we begin to break down the individual character stories, we learn that Ken has developed both a personal and business relationship with Karen Kanzuki, as she has taken over her family's business, which does later come into play once Bison begins to activate the Black Moon. Knowing of the danger they possess, Ken does reach out to Ryu, and the two have a sparring match, with Ken victorious, realizing that his mind is still clouded by the Dark Hado, despite having trained under Gouken once more. So Ken would travel to the Kanzuki estate, as Ryu learned to clear his mind. It's here where we learn from Karen that whilst the moons present a great threat to the world, they can only be activated with different keys, with some being in their own possession. So it would be their job to travel across the globe and track down the remaining pieces, with Ken, Chun-Li and Cammy traveling to Brazil and meeting the likes of Sean and Laura Matsuda. And after fending off Fang and his Shadoloos soldiers, he then challenges Laura to win over her piece. With this key in their possession, and Ryu having now regained his focus and cleansed the Dark Hado, the two are reunited as they wage their final assault against Shadoloos and M.Bison, where the dictator is defeated for the final time with a massive Hadouken. After the events of the Shadow's fall, Ken realizes that it's finally time for himself and Ryu to have that rematch, one that determines who was the better student. With a cleared mind, Ryu is able to defeat Ken, who can't help but feel proud of the piece his brother has found, handing him back his fallen red headband and telling him that he'll need it for next time. And this now takes us on to our last installment, Street Fighter 3, and a lot has changed between the events of 5 and 3, where Ken and his family have moved to Southern California, and Ken himself has taken on a student, that's being the young Sean Matsuda, creating a hybrid style of Ansatsuken whilst combining it with the traditions of his family's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Ken is a harsh but very fair teacher, wanting to see the best in his student by pushing him to his limits. But training Sean, whilst being a family man, is extremely difficult to maintain his own fighting spirit. So during the events of 3, he does seek out Ryu and introduces him to Sean, but everything changes once another World Warrior tournament does begin, as it encourages him to train once more and pick up where he had left off. It also helps he's further encouraged once he realizes that Mel himself is interested in training. As we move on to the tournament, we quickly come to learn that not all is as it seems, because behind the shadows, this was all orchestrated by a secret society led by Gil. Due to this series of games having come out during the arcade era, we aren't able to pin everything down, but from what we do know is that Ken may have crossed paths with the ruthless Urian and lost to Ryu during the tournament. Yet, this did not stop Ken from continuing to compete, as he does go on to win another US martial arts tournament, setting a new record. So by the end of Street Fighter 3, Ken is a father, a husband, a businessman, and a teacher, having grown exponentially since the very first Street Fighter game. Of every character we've seen in the series, Ken might actually be the character that has evolved the most. But with Street Fighter 6 on the horizon, and Ken mysteriously stripped of his wealth and his family, it raises the question of who was responsible for dethroning Ken and putting his family in danger. We can only wait and see. But for now, everyone, that has been it for the history of Ken. I hope you have enjoyed this video and learnt more by doing so. I wasn't kidding at the very start here when I say there is a drastic and very different contrast between Ryu and Ken as characters, with Ryu opting to follow the more stereotypical wandering warrior, whereas Ken decided to find some footing and settle down with his business and his family. It's been very fun exploring the different sides of both of these characters, despite their beginnings being very similar. Now, just a heads up before we do wrap up, I will let you all know now that the next Street Fighter episode will be focused around Jury. So anyway guys, as always, stay strong, stay well, and keep on fighting as we all await for Street Fighter 6's release. Take care everyone, I'll see you all soon.